Do you think your life is hard? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in the Middle Ages. No tap water, no electricity, no refrigerator, no bathroom full of soap, and none of the tiny luxuries of the modern world that make you comfortable. Before morning even came, you would start thinking, how do I get out of here? Because modern comforts really did soften us. But the things medieval people faced every day would seem like a horror movie to us today. Come on, let's first look at their meals. Because even after the very first bite, you might start screaming inside for help to return to the 21st century. First, forget the big, magnificent feasts you saw in movies, with goblets flying through the air and meat overflowing off the tables. Those were mostly decoration from a fairy tale world. For ordinary people, meals were usually neither glamorous nor safe. In fact, they were often not even boring. They were downright depressing. The things people ate were, frankly, as exciting as watching paint dry. The main meal of peasants was usually something called pottage. This was a watery, tired, slightly desperate soup made from whatever was on hand, with vegetables simmering in the same pot for days. In other words, the Middle Ages version of my mom's mysterious dish. But here, what was hidden was not the vegetables, but most of the time worms and filth. Bread was the staple food of almost everyone. But we are not talking about the soft, sliced, delicious-smelling bread we know today. Medieval bread was hard, dark, coarse, and often had things mixed into it that you would not want. The flour was ground in stone mills, and over time, those stones would also mix tiny stone fragments into the flour. People's teeth were strong, but not because they were eating healthily. It was because they were literally chewing gritty dough all their lives. And there was more. One of the things you would call horrifying today could be hidden even in an ordinary loaf of bread back then. A fungus called ergot, which grows in rye, could contaminate bread. Ergot poisoning could cause hallucinations, a burning sensation, and even death. Some historians think this poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria. Imagine it, an entire town slipping out of reality at the same time, thinking their neighbor was a witch, when in fact there was no witch at all. Just an unclean bakery. Meat, meanwhile, was considered a luxury for most people. And when they did somehow get meat, it was often on the verge of spoiling, because there was no refrigerator to keep it fresh. They would want to use spices to mask the taste, of course, if they could afford them. If they could not, all that was left was to pinch your nose and chew as fast as possible. Today's 5-second rule would be funny in comparison. In the Middle Ages, it was almost more like a 5-day rule. But the real problem was this: you could not drink water with that meal, because the water itself was dangerous. Rivers, wells, and fountains were often contaminated with human waste and all kinds of filth. So everyone, including children, drank beer or ale. Of course, it was not as strong as today's versions. It was lighter because the boiling process reduced germs. According to one study, the average medieval peasant drank about 8 pints of ale a day. Even 5-year-old children consumed ale with their meals. In the Middle Ages, children did not need fake IDs. They needed IDs to be allowed to drink water. Fish was also a common food, but it too was usually dried or salted, because fresh fish spoiled very quickly. People living in coastal towns might see newly caught fish, but for someone living inland, fish arrived days or even weeks later. Even the smell was enough to blow a person's mind. And now we come to the subject that truly turns the stomach: the toilet situation. For an average person, this meant using a chamber pot or a bucket. In other words, a container placed under the bed, waiting for you in the silence of the night. When it was full, either you emptied it yourself or you waited for someone to come take it away. So where did it go? Most of the time, straight out the window, and into the street. The medieval warning of, "Watch out, something might fall from above," was not actually for falling objects, but for falling feces. In towns, before people threw waste out of upper windows, they would shout, "Gardez-vous." This warning came from the French phrase, "Gardez-l'eau," meaning, "Beware of the water." Of course, what they called water was often far worse than water. This practice was so common that in some cities, waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 p.m. If you were lucky enough to visit a castle, you might come across something called a garderobe. This was a hole in a stone seat that would drop waste directly down, outside the castle wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe that dropped waste nearly 70 feet. Kings and queens had thrones. With so much hard labor and poor nutrition, the body would break down quickly. And disease was everywhere. Medicine was almost non-existent, and what was offered as healthcare would clearly count as torture today. Medieval WebMD had only one diagnosis for everything: you were probably going to die. Even a simple cold, something we get through today with rest and over-the-counter medicine, could mean death back then. Because concepts like germs, infection, and contagion were not known. They believed illness came from bad air or from an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Fever? Then it was time for bloodletting. That meant cutting a vein and letting the blood drain into a bowl. The basic logic of medieval doctors was, "You have too much blood, I'll reduce it a bit." Leeches were also popular. These blood-sucking creatures were attached to the skin, supposedly to draw out bad blood. In fact, some medical texts recommended using as many as 70 leeches at once in certain cases. The consequences were horrifying. Death rates from disease were very high. About 30% of children died before reaching age 5, and average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. The Black Death wiped out roughly half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were a separate nightmare. There were no proper toothbrushes, no knowledge of oral hygiene, so tooth decay was extremely common. Medieval dentists did not schedule appointments. They waited until someone screamed loudly enough in town. The medicines used at the time were often poisonous themselves. Mercury was given for everything from skin diseases to syphilis. There were no long side effect lists on medicine labels back then, because the side effect already meant, "It might kill you before the disease does." Worst of all, many diseases spread because of poor hygiene. Their hand sanitizer was basically rubbing dirty hands on even dirtier clothes. That was like trying to wipe a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. But even if you somehow survived all that medical torture, do not think the troubles of the Middle Ages ended there. Life could still push you to the limit in other ways. The justice system was not just blind, it was cruel, unjust, and often completely random. The law worked with a logic that would horrify even modern lawyers. First of all, the laws changed from town to town. Something completely legal in one place could get you thrown in a dungeon just 5 miles away. There was no standard legal system. Ordinary people only learned what counted as a crime when they were accused. Medieval Miranda rights were basically this: you have the right to be punished. You have the right to beg for mercy. Good luck. Punishment was often in no way proportionate to the crime. A minor offense, like stealing food out of hunger, could result in your hand being cut off. In medieval England, more than 200 crimes carried the death penalty. These included cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing property worth more than 12 pence. Courts were not like they are today. If you were accused of a crime, proving your innocence often depended on the horrific method called trial by ordeal. The accused might be made to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet. If the burn healed cleanly within 3 days, you were considered innocent. But since modern medicine did not exist, infection was almost inevitable. If you became infected, you were declared guilty. In short, it was a test based on the logic of, let's see whether God stops this pain. Another method was trial by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and would be executed. The reasoning was that water was pure, so it would reject the guilty. That made it a truly unwinnable game for the accused. For those found guilty, punishment was made public in the most horrifying way possible. Hanging was actually one of the more merciful methods. But drawing and quartering was reserved especially for serious crimes like treason. The condemned was dragged through the streets by horses, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled alive, beheaded, and then cut into 4 pieces. Executions were almost like public events. Huge crowds would gather and watch as if it were a show, with food and drink in hand. Entertainment options in the Middle Ages were limited. Either you watched someone be executed, or you stared at the wall at home. Most people chose the execution. Nobles, however, were rarely subject to the same justice system as ordinary people. If a noble was accused of a crime, he could request trial by combat. That is, he could hire a professional fighter to fight in his place. Wealthy criminals could escape punishment by paying blood money to the victims' families. The poor, by contrast, had almost no right to defense. And what about prisons? Medieval prisons were not for long-term punishment. They were used as waiting areas until the real punishment arrived. They were dark, cramped, overcrowded pits. Prisoners were chained to the walls or the floor. The state did not provide food. Prisoners lived on what their families brought them, or starved. Torture was a natural part of the legal process. It was used not only to punish, but also to extract confessions. The rack stretched limbs until they were pulled out of place. There was a device called the Iron Maiden, a spiked, coffin-like instrument. Thumb screws crushed fingers. When people could no longer endure the pain, they confessed to everything. The result was often still execution. The slogan of the medieval justice system might as well have been, "Confess or suffer." Then suffer anyway. There were also public humiliation punishments for minor crimes. Being locked in the stocks meant sitting in a public square with your head and hands trapped between wooden boards. The townspeople would then throw rotten food, mud, and worse at you. The ducking stool was usually used for women who gossiped or argued with their husbands. The woman was tied to a chair and repeatedly dumped into water. Law enforcement was equally primitive and inadequate. There was no professional police force. Towns hired night watchmen, often elderly men. Their job was to shout and raise the alarm when they saw fire or crime. Medieval police would not read you your rights. They would just shout, "Thief!" and hope someone in the crowd would trip you with a kick. Even being accused while innocent could ruin your life. There was no presumption of innocence. Once accused, you were presumed guilty, and the burden was on you to prove otherwise. Through those terrible trials, if the law did not kill you, perhaps the next horror would, war. Medieval warfare was nothing like what you see in movies. Forget the scenes of shining armored knights charging heroically across broad plains. Real war was chaotic, brutal, and for an ordinary person, almost certain death. Wars were constant. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted from 1337 to 1453, 116 years of intermittent conflict. In those times, an average person would see multiple wars in a single lifetime. Today, many people live their whole lives without ever seeing war up close. Armor was not as glamorous as it looked either. Full-plate armor was only affordable for the richest knights, and its cost was close to that of a modern sports car. A full suit of armor was equal to 2 or 3 years of income for a skilled craftsman. Most soldiers wore, if they were lucky, a padded cloth garment called a gambeson with a few metal plates sewn on. Gleaming armored knights were the medieval equivalent of people driving expensive sports cars. Rare, flashy, and probably trying to compensate for something. Weapons were not romantic either. Swords were expensive and mostly used by knights and nobles. Ordinary soldiers used spears, axes, or battlefield versions of farming tools. One of the most feared weapons was the longbow, because at close range it could pierce most armor. English longbowmen trained from childhood, and the effects of drawing 200-pound bows thousands of times even changed their bones. War itself was a massacre. At the Battle of Toten in 1461, around 28,000 men were killed in a single day, which was about 1% of England's total male population. Many froze to death in a blizzard before even seeing the battlefield. Wounds were another death sentence, because infection was more dangerous than the first injury itself. For peasants, the worst part of war was sometimes not the fighting itself, but what armies did between battles. Medieval armies lived off the surrounding villages for food and supplies. That meant crops were burned, animals killed, and homes destroyed. Soldiers from both sides looted villages, leaving famine behind. The medieval version of "support our troops" would have been, "please do not steal all our food and burn our houses." Sieges were especially brutal. When an army surrounded a castle or walled town, those trapped inside would slowly be starved out. During the siege of Paris in 885 to 886, people had to eat rats, cats, and eventually each other. Sieges could last for months, even years. The siege of Candia, or modern Heraclion, in the 1600s lasted 21 years, making it the longest siege in history. Far more people died from disease than from battle. Armies created the perfect breeding ground for illness with poor sanitation, crowding, filthy water, and not enough food. During the Crusades, European armies could lose half their soldiers to disease before even reaching their target. Medieval army doctors had two main treatments: put some dirt on it for small wounds and prepare for the afterlife for everything else. For civilians, the choices were equally awful. Fleeing a war zone meant abandoning your home, your belongings, and your safety, and risking starvation on the road. Staying put meant suffering whatever violence the passing armies brought. Women and children were not safe either. Medieval chronicles describe entire villages being destroyed without regard for age or gender. If you somehow escaped conscription, avoided roaming armies, and survived the famine caused by war, you still had to endure all the everyday misery of medieval life. First came the smell. Medieval towns stank of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, tanning chemicals, slaughterhouse remains, and the smoke of countless fires. There was no garbage collection system. Waste built up in the streets or was thrown straight into the river. Butchers dumped animal entrails and blood in front of their shops. The smell was so strong that people carried small herb sachets to hold to their noses. It was the Middle Ages version of air freshener, but with one bad smell layered on top of another. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, usually in spring and late summer. Some thought bathing opened the pores and let disease in. In winter, people might go 4 or 5 months without washing. Lice were so common that special combs to remove them were standard grooming items. In the Middle Ages, even writing "slide lice problem" on a dating profile might have counted as a plus. Clothes were uncomfortable, rarely washed, and worn until they completely fell apart. Underclothes were made of rough linen that irritated the skin, and outer garments were made of heavy wool that itched constantly. Rich or poor, Most people had only 2 or 3 sets of clothing in total. Shoes were made of thin leather, had flat soles, and offered almost no protection from the weather. The language barrier would be much bigger than you think. Middle English from the 1400s would seem almost like a foreign language to modern English speakers. Even simple sentences like, "What is your name?" would be incomprehensible. You would not understand others, and they would think you were speaking nonsense. Even conversation was a battle. There was no privacy. Most houses had only one room. Everyone ate, worked, and slept in the same place. Beds were shared among family members, and sometimes travelers slept in the same bed as strangers. Even in wealthy homes, servants were always present, even in private moments. Entertainment was limited and often violent. Public executions drew crowds and were watched like festivals. Animal fights, where dogs attacked chained bears or bulls, were popular. More peaceful forms of entertainment included watching traveling performers or listening to minstrels tell stories. But these were rare luxuries. The social structure was brutally fixed as well. Under the feudal system, everyone had a set place and social mobility was almost non-existent. About 90% of the population were peasants, who had nothing and worked land owned by nobles. Changing status, changing occupations, or moving up was extremely rare. Knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the gap. People believed in witches, devils, and magical beings. Illnesses were blamed on evil spirits, bad air, or the positions of the stars. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, fearing the end of the world. In the Middle Ages, fact-checking meant asking the oldest person in the village, "Did you hear this too?" Communication was slow and unreliable as well. News traveled at the speed of a walking messenger or a mounted courier. Information from 50 miles away could take days, and news from other countries might arrive months later or never arrive at all. Information was not at your fingertips like today. It was as uncertain as the wind. And in the end, after all these medieval horrors, you would find yourself begging to return to the comforts of modern life. Antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, deodorant, all of them would suddenly seem like blessings. The past may look romantic, noble, and magical in books and films. But in reality, the Middle Ages were a world where every day was a struggle to survive. And let's be honest, most of us would not last even one day in that world.